Hello everyone, I'm Dr. Hannah Young, and today I will be speaking on Glass in an Atlantic Context, Ralph Bernal, Collecting and Slave Ownership. In 1855, James Robinson Planché noted that collector Ralph Bernal was, quote, distinguished by the perfection of his taste as well as the extent of his knowledge. Although vast and quite varied, Bernal's extensive collection of objets d'art contained over 500 items of glassware, including mainly Venetian, German and ruby glass. Displayed at his home in Belgravia's Eaton Square in London, the contents of this collection were both material symbols of and themselves work to construct ideas about wealth, taste and expertise. Bernal was one of the most celebrated collectors of his time. When he died in 1854, his obituary in the Times declared that in matters of taste and art, Mr. Bernal's judgment was justly esteemed as one of the best in England. We can now find glassware from his collection in museums across Britain and the United States, including in the Victoria and Albert Museum, the British Museum, and the Corning Museum of Glass. But Bernal wasn't just a politician and collector, as he is very frequently referred to, including in this extract here from the V&A Archive Research Guide. In addition to his extensive collection of decorative arts, Bernal owned 3 Jamaican plantations, upon which at any one time he enslaved well over 500 people. This paper seeks to add to the efforts of academics, writers, artists and community groups who have begun to reinscribe slave ownership onto British history. It will explore both the slave ownership and collecting practices of Ralph Bernal, showing that these different facets of Bernal's identity weren't separate or distinct and can't properly be understood in isolation from one another. Although I'm looking at one very specific case study, I hope the example of Bernal demonstrates why we cannot and should not uncritically valorize the connoisseur without interrogating the power relations that underpinned the ways their collections and reputations were constructed. Approaching these collectors from a standpoint that evaluates their knowledge and expertise as deployed in the acquisition of these collections, whilst ignoring the social and economic conditions that enabled their production, only serves to reinforce a colonial way of seeing. Indeed, evading the source of Bernal's wealth merely reproduces, even unconsciously, the strategies of 19th century slave owners themselves. Bernal himself didn't articulate the connections between his slave ownership and his collecting practices, but that doesn't mean they weren't important. Indeed, silences like this weren't coincidental. They were systematic features of slaveholding culture and, as a consequence, of the archival record we have inherited. These epistemic erasures have framed and really underpinned the narratives about Bernal that continue to be privileged today. In putting Bernal's collecting practices and his slave ownership within the same framework, this paper aims to make these histories and connections present in their absence. We cannot understand Bernal's collection without acknowledging the violence, material and epistemic, that though not immediately visible, is nonetheless embedded within it. Ralph Bernal was born in 1783 into a Sephardic Jewish family, although at the age of 21 he was baptized. Although it's not the focus of my paper today, the complex and changing status of Jewish people in 19th century Britain is certainly a significant part of this story. But while Bernal's Jewishness undoubtedly informed and shaped his connoisseurship, as well as the way that he and his collection were perceived, the process of normalizing wealth derived from enslavement through investing in properties in the British metropole, whether in the form of land, buildings or objects, was one common to many, many British absentees, that is, those who enslaved people in the Caribbean but lived in Britain. In Bernal's case, this process began in 1811, when, upon the death of his father, he received an inheritance that changed the course of the rest of his life. This primarily consisted of 3 Jamaican estates, Cherry Garden, Richmond, and Edinburgh Castle, and the 545 individuals that were enslaved upon them. With no other significant income, Bernal's slave ownership fundamentally underpinned the politician, collector, and gentleman that he was able to become. Fairly immediately, Bernal's inheritance enabled him to enter the world of politics. He was first elected as a Member of Parliament in 1818, and he held a seat in the House of Commons for the next 36 years. Although a Whig, Bernal became a prominent member of the parliamentary West India interest. He made contributions to debates about the reductions of the sugar duties, amelioration, and the European slave trade. But there was one subject of particular concern: abolition, and its impact upon those who enslaved others in the Caribbean. By the mid-1820s, a number of West Indian MPs, as they were known, had begun to accept the inevitability of emancipation and organise themselves accordingly. Understanding that the fight for emancipation was lost, they didn't necessarily question the principle of abolition, but fought to delay and control its imposition. Bernal's most important intervention came on the 19th of May, 1826, in a speech in the Commons. The speech was imbued with the racism used by slave owners who advocated a gradual emancipation process. Abolition, he argued, should not be undertaken with, quote, indiscreet haste, but rather with a due regard to the capability of the enslaved for receiving those advantages which it might be proposed to confer on them. The denouement of this speech highlighted Bernal's overarching priority. The question of property, he declared, should never be lost in these discussions. By placing property rights at the centre of their arguments, slave-owning MPs aimed to establish unequivocally the legitimacy of the right to financial compensation. That this property was held in other human beings was deemed irrelevant. These efforts weren't undertaken in vain. The British government eventually awarded £20 million in compensation. Bernal himself received £11,460 for 564 people enslaved on his 3 Jamaican estates. The enslaved, of course, received nothing. Perhaps unsurprisingly, Bernal's speeches made little reference to the individuals he enslaved and exploited. Instead, they were littered with general references to, quote, Negroes, slaves, and unfortunate beings, terms that only serve to dehumanize. The only time that he specifically referred to those enslaved on his Jamaican estates was on the eve of abolition. These people, he proclaimed, would, quote, have but little advantage in the change. They were now happy and comfortable, and in sickness they were taken care of. This, it should go without saying, was nothing more than fiction. It certainly didn't reflect the brutal and violent reality of plantation life. Indeed, in 1837, when Quaker abolitionists Joseph Sturge and Thomas Harvey visited Bernal's Richmond estate, they commented on the particularly horrific conditions on the plantation. In 1817, there were 601 people enslaved on Bernal's 3 Jamaican estates, including Hamlet, 66, Dolly, 18, and Friendship, who was then just 4 years old. The nature of the historical record means that it's difficult to know much about the individual lives and experiences of the people enslaved by Bernal. As Saidia Hartman and Marissa Fuentes, amongst several others, have highlighted, the archive reproduces an epistemic violence that was itself part of the technology of power that facilitated the very real violence faced by Hamlet, Dolly, Friendship, and hundreds of others. It does, though, perhaps also offer a glimpse into the humanity of the men and women that that men and women like Ralph Bernal tried very hard to, but couldn't deny. It's important that we as 21st century historians remember the lives and voices and experiences of the men, women and children enslaved by Bernal. This can only be done by recognising that the foundations of Bernal's collecting, that is so often widely praised, rested upon the lives of the hundreds of people who were exploited and denied basic rights of freedom for his economic benefit. Certainly, the links between Bernal's slave ownership and his collecting practices were direct. His obituary in the Gentleman's Magazine noted that he'd been collecting for around 40 years, suggesting that this process began shortly after he inherited his 3 Jamaican estates. But Bernal's collecting seems to have escalated in the mid-1830s. He first appeared in the Waste Book of curiosity dealer John Coleman Isaac on the 14th of May 1834, while fellow collector, parliamentarian and slave owner Joseph Marryat noted that he began forming his collection of Majolica around 1838. Sorry. Now, I don't think that this timing is remotely coincidental. In September 1835 and January 1836, Ralph Bernal received 2 payments totaling over £11,000, his compensation money. I think it's extremely likely that it was this compensation that underpinned Bernal's sudden and marked increase in expenditure. Bernal used this influx of capital to take advantage of a burgeoning trade in antiquities and curiosities, including, as I've already mentioned, in glass. Now, I am not by any sense an expert in glass, so apologies for the fact that I can only offer a very simplistic overview of its glassware. The majority of it was Venetian glass from the 16th and 17th centuries and German from the 17th and 18th. The appeal of these objects came both in the way that they exemplified innovative design and decorative techniques. Here we have an example of vetro retorti, I hope I pronounced that all right, and some enamelled glass, both from Bernal's collection. And also, I think part of the interest in these objects came in their historical associations. These items were produced at what were deemed to be the high points of European glassmaking. These pieces of glass were classic examples of what Bernal termed curious objects. And in lots of respects, his collecting practices were fairly conventionally curious, echoing those of late 18th and early 19th century collectors who saw themselves as both connoisseurs, expert judges of aesthetic criteria, and antiquarians, whose objects marked imaginations and became doorways to the past. Curator Augustus Franks highlighted the significance of the antiquarian aspects of Bernal's collecting, noting that he wasn't just interested in objects that possessed aesthetic value or that were exemplars of any particular type, but which also had a date on them, the name of an artist, or some interesting historical association. In acquiring such objects, collectors like Bernal reinforced their own identities as men of rationality and reason, celebrating the achievements of both historical civilizations and, implicitly, themselves. Through his collection, Bernal challenged and reconfigured contemporary ideas about antiquarianism, taste, and connoisseurship, demonstrating that the former and the latter were not mutually exclusive. As one of the first British collectors to gather objets d'art on a very large scale, Arthur McGregor has argued that Bernal was a pioneering collector who helped to develop a field of connoisseurship specifically concerned with decorative arts. Certainly, the resurgence of interest in historic Venetian glass in the sort of mid-19th century could be pretty directly traced to the sale of the Bernal collection in 1855. Bernal's collection then was very different from the likes of Hans Sloane or George Hibbert, His collections included botanical specimens from Jamaica, musical instruments used by enslaved people, or certainly in the case of Sloane, the whips and chains that were used upon them. Items which evidently linked their collections with the source of their wealth and the islands on which they enslaved other people. Bernal was interested not in botany, natural history, or archaeology, but decorative arts, and as such, Jamaican artifacts held little appeal. His glassware was very much characteristic of his wider collection, which was constituted primarily of European objects, or along with some, quote, Oriental porcelain armor and enamel. The collection of such items worked to reinforce racial ideas about antiquity and civilization as associated with Eurasia and not the Americas or Egypt, excepted Africa. The objects in Bernal's collection were considered decorative arts worthy of esteem in a way that those from the Americas and African continents weren't. Slave ownership may have seemed to have left barely a trace in Bernal's collection then, but I would argue that the absence of Caribbean objects is as significant as their presence would be. There is one possible exception to this. Within Bernal's collection, there were several dozen objects with depictions of Black figures on them, including an item of ruby glass with, quote, a Negro's head that was described as very fine. Such objects, of course, weren't rare among the domestic spaces of the elite. Since the 15th and 16th centuries, blackamoor figures had frequently adorned fashionable decorative arts. These ornaments portrayed anonymous African figures in a European image, often nebulously conflating servile conceptions of blackness, an increasingly common trope, and exoticized and orientalized visions of the Arab and Muslim world. It's impossible to know whether Bernal consciously made any association between these figures and the people enslaved in Jamaica. He probably didn't. But there is no doubt that the trope of the ornamental black encoded and normalized an inherently racialized power dynamic within objects that were designed to signify luxury, wealth, and taste. The objectification and commodification of blackness lay at the heart of both the representation of Black figures in decorative arts and Bernal's enslavement of African Jamaicans. It also reminds us that the process of valuing, acquiring, consuming, and constructing art was itself one of the ways that slave owners like Bernal worked to reproduce racialized hierarchies. It's certainly not the most groundbreaking point, but we can't understand Bernal's collecting without recognizing that race has always been culturally constructed and culture has always been racially constructed. Bernal's collection was sold in 1855, a year after his death, and here is some glassware illustrated in the sale catalogue. Very quickly, both the sale, which took place over 32 days and contained over 4,000 items, came to occupy a pivotal position in histories of 19th century collecting. As the turn of the 20th century approached, esteemed curator John Charles Robinson looked back at the development of British museums and collections. Bernal was a pioneer in a new direction, he insisted, with the sale of his collection an epoch-making occurrence. It's thus unsurprising that 21st century curators and historians continue to highlight the influence Bernal and the Bernal collection played in 19th century cultural life, and particularly in collecting, whether in describing him as a discerning collector or commenting on the superb quality of his collection. What regularly continues to be evaded, though, is how this collection was bound up with the history of transatlantic enslavement. Ralph Bernal, noted ceramics expert Joseph Marriott in 1857, was known to have been a collector of unrivaled taste and judgment. But Bernal was one of many, including Marriott himself, who normalised his wealth derived from the labours of enslaved people by spending it in the manner of a refined and tasteful gentleman. His prodigious collecting was part of the process of self-fashioning, enabling him to construct an identity that was far removed from the distant reaches of the plantation societies of the Caribbean, whilst nevertheless continuing to defend and profit from his Jamaican enslavement. The objects from the Bernal collection are now found in eminent museums across the globe, and this history never mentioned is a testament to his success in establishing a reputation as a gentleman of culture and taste. The objects once found in the collection of Ralph Bernal could of course still be appreciated for their beauty, their art historical significance, or their aesthetic qualities. However, it's important to reckon that amongst many other histories, they also embody those of violence and trauma. The lives of people like Hamlet, Dolly, and Friendship, and the hundreds of others enslaved on Bernal's Jamaican plantations are ineffably tied to these objects. Their meaning can't be divorced from this history. It's only by interrogating how collections like Bernal's were funded and how they work to fortify and remake racial hierarchies, that we can begin to understand the complex ways that slavery, race, culture, and taste were entwined in 18th and 19th century Britain. And, I might add, to begin to disrupt structural inequalities that continue to pervade British society as one of the most potent legacies of this history. Thank you all for listening, and I really look forward to seeing you for some really interesting discussions in a couple of weeks. Thank you.